What are your thoughts when I tell you that we've all been falling into a trap over the last 5 decades when it comes to the question which macronutrient may most contribute to higher total energy intake? I'm sure you agree that this question is highly relevant, given the unstopped obesity epidemic we're facing for more than 50 years now. From millions of dietary reports in humans, we know that carbohydrates contribute about 50%, fats about 30 to 35%, and proteins about 15 to 20% to total energy intake each day. This is true for the majority of children as well as for adults. As fats contain more than twice the amount of energy per gram mass compared to carbohydrates or proteins, it was reasonable to blame fats first for higher total energy intake and the subsequent obesity epidemic. However, things didn't really add up, research results were conflicting, hence the next on the list was targeted. However, as with fats, monotheistic efforts focusing on carbohydrates only could not explain higher total energy intake nor the obesity epidemic. So, the research done so far desperately required being challenged. A new thinking, a new method was required, and eureka, it was found. The solution was nutritional geometry and compositional data analysis, which incorporated the proportions of all three relevant macronutrients that contribute to total energy intake. The reason for this is simple. Whenever you increase the proportional intake of one macronutrient, the proportional intake of any or both of the other two has to decrease to add up to 100%. Applying nutritional geometry and compositional data analysis revealed that the seemingly minuscule proportion of proteins had a disproportionately high impact on total energy intake, a mechanism termed protein leverage. And the association was inverse. The lower the proportion of proteins in the diet, the higher the resulting total energy intake. Professors David Raubenheimer and Stephen Simpson were the first to provide evidence for protein leverage in experiments with locusts. As for any other free-living insect, they usually do not develop obesity. They ingest as much energy for growth, development and reproduction as they need. However, in the lab, when exposed to diets with a low proportion of proteins, guess what happened? The locusts became grossly obese, unable to mold and fly, unable to reproduce. These poor insects, exposed to a low-protein diet, desperately aimed to reach their protein target, but could only do so at costs of overeating, putting on weight and turning unfit for survival and unfit for reproduction. Similar studies in more than 30 species, including our closest relatives, the primate apes, have shown again and again consistent results. Proteins are the main determinants for total energy intake, irrespective of whether the diets were diluted by carbohydrates or fats. But what about humans? The first randomized controlled trial on protein leverage in humans was done in a Swiss chalet, including 10 students. During the first phase of the study, students could freely choose how much and what they wanted to eat from the very rich buffet. They did well at keeping their proportional intake of proteins at 18%, pretty much as what you would expect according to the literature. In the second phase, students were grouped to a high protein versus a high fat and high carbohydrate buffet, and the protein leverage effect kicked in. Students in both groups tried to maintain their protein intake, but to do so, those allocated to the high carb and high fat buffet had to ingest 35% more calories to achieve their protein target. Okay, this is it for adults. Many randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews and large observational studies have resulted in sound evidence for protein leverage. But what about children? How does protein leverage behave with breastfeeding versus formula feeding, with pubertal development and with growth? These were questions we tried to answer. We had access to a true treasure of longitudinal research data in children and adolescents, the Special Turku Coronary Risk Factor Intervention Project, the STRIP cohort from Turku, Finland. For STRIP, a total of 1,062 infants aged 7 months were recruited and had data on growth, nutrition and many more assessed every year until they reached their 20th birthday. Applying the nutritional framework and compositional analysis, the results were just amazing. We could identify protein leverage at every single year of assessment from 7 months to 20 years. Also at age, we could show that the proportion of proteins determined total energy intake, irrespective of the proportion of carbohydrates or fats. Cool, isn't it? Of course, we challenged our results, but they were robust to adjustments for sex, for early feeding with breast milk versus formula, for the onset of puberty, and for individual growth patterns. The only thing that changed across aging was the strength of protein leverage, but protein leverage was always there. So, what are the take-home messages from our study results? First, our study results explain why humans from very early on failed to control total energy intake on a diet with high proportions of fats and carbohydrates but low proportions of proteins, which is exactly the composition of ultra-processed foods and the typical westernized diet. Second, our study results provide evidence for legislators and politicians to think about regulating the food industry. Regulatory opportunities may include an accurate labeling of the macronutrients composition or maybe a taxing of food items that are artificially composed with lots of fats and sugars but low in proteins. Third, our results highlight that it is all about the macronutrients composition, not about a single food component. The macronutrient composition of our food must be balanced to fit with our appetites, of which the one for proteins seems to be the most important, at least when it comes to energy intake. Before the end, another rather personal learning on how to avoid jumping to conclusions and how to avoid traps. As scientists, we must be mindful not to simply accept the seemingly most obvious explanation for a given problem. Rather, we must be open for alternatives and include all possible options, as irrelevant they may appear at the first glance. To finish, I'd like to motivate you to look at the composition of your next meal in a very easy way. In my weight management clinic, I advise for a fist-sized portion of carbohydrates, a hand plate size of proteins, and as many veggies, fruits and salads as you can eat. Does your diet match this recommendation? If so, you're well on track.